Okay, welcome back. This is the second lecture of the Process to Synthesis lectures in the junior seminar class. The first lecture was on artist books and process books, and the second lecture is on process grids and process boards and grid presentations. And the reason for that is because part of your synthesis project, you're going to be first making them into grid installations, making a grid of 9, I think, and then a grid of 4 before finally making your final synthesis project. And so students are always wanted to always have a lot of questions as to what does that look like and what can they do. So I made this lecture to both answer that question, but also to show a lot of contemporary artists. I want to talk just a little bit about the fact, once again, about Professor Dickey is teaching the junior seminar class this semester, and I'm very excited about this. There's no one who I would trust with this class more, and I should, because he's my boss, but also because he and I were right there. It was in those conversations that we had together right at the beginning that led to the design of the junior seminar class. And so I think no one more than Professor Dickey really understands the things that we were talking about that led to the creation of the class, and understands my thinking that led me to the way I developed the class in the first place. And I think his interpretation of the class is going to be amazing. And I'm really excited about this collaboration aspect of it, of these lectures being purely online, and for students to be able to listen to these and watch these online. So the other point I wanted to make before we get too far along was I said that one of the goals of this lecture is to show you a lot of contemporary artists, and you may have noticed there were some contemporary artists in the first lecture, such as Anselm Kiefer, Ed Ruscha, Brian Detmer. And keep in mind that these artists will be things that you need to pay attention to. You need to remember them and know their bodies of work, because at the end of the class there is a test on contemporary artists. And if it's anything like the test that I made, it won't be so much about identifying individual works of art. It'll be about looking at lots of images, a body of work for each artist, and being able to go, oh yeah, that's that artist. So anyway, let's talk about grids. First of all, grids in 20th century art, especially in the latter half of the 20th century and in the 21st century, grids and grid display have been really important in contemporary art. And there are a lot of artists that we could talk about, and we could start with any number of them, but I'm going to start with Terry Winters, in part because I love Terry Winters. I love his drawings, I love his prints, and I love his paintings. But it was especially in printmaking where he tends to do these kind of these grid displays, and the grids are there in part to kind of communicate this idea of process by showing the process of his different ways of thinking on any particular subject, right? Or any kind of thinking about a set of mark making systems, and then that leading to a number of ideas that come out of it. Then the grid is a way of kind of displaying all of those different ideas. Here's another example. And here's Jennifer Bartlett. I include her in part because when I was an art student, Jennifer Bartlett's career was very, very hot. She was one of the most important artists of the 80s, and she was definitely an artist that whenever her name came up, art teachers would talk about the importance of the grid. She very much used grid installations and grid displays as part of her work, and used that for a lot of different kinds of reasons. Sol LeWitt as well, really going all the way back to the 60s, was making artwork where he was using grid presentation systems. And I think one of the reasons why grids work so well with 20th century, late 20th century, and 21st century art, contemporary art, is because it very much is this idea of displaying artwork in as democratic means as possible, where there isn't a clear sense of like, this is the most important. Everything is given kind of a similar amount of space and is displayed where it's almost all equal. Certainly in any grid there are certain locations that are more important than others, but grid display gets as close as you could possibly get to a very kind of objective and democratic kind of display of a lot of information, a lot of visual information. Most people don't think of Gerhard Richter when they think of grids, but he does do some grid pieces. This is a large piece. I think it's about like maybe 9 feet tall. And the pieces when he does make grid work, it's all about these color studies that he makes. He makes these one body of work that Gerhard Richter has always been making all through this whole process is just sort of like almost a typology of all these different types of colors that he has explored and found in his studio process. And then these grids are kind of like an organization of that. Although when I was discussing this lecture earlier with my kids thought of this much more in terms of like all the imagery they see within the grid patterns. The more you look at it, the more you start seeing lots of repetitions of diagonals, or Lucy found a lot of number shapes and letter forms and hearts. So Damien Hirst makes very similar kinds of grids on similar kind of ideas. His grids these kind of like polka dot grids really come out of an extension of kind of installation grids he made where he was displaying pharmaceuticals, displaying different pills in kind of a grid format, and then that kind of evolved into these polka dot pieces. And Zach Smith he had a famous piece that was in the Whitney Biennial back when he was a very young artist, and he made this piece that was about he did this kind of process piece where he read Pynchon's novel. I think it was V. It might have been Gravity's Rainbow, but I think it was V. He read a Pynchon novel, and then made for every page of the novel he made a different drawing / painting, and then displayed the whole thing in this wall installation grid. So it's a very, very specific type of process piece. The last time we were in New York City for a New York trip, the last time I was in it, not because the very, very last time we went, I didn't get to go. One of the galleries we went to see had this large installation by Pedro Reyes, and it included both sculptural works, but also these kind of wall grids. And one of the things that made me think about was how in some ways there's not much difference between salon style hanging and grid hanging, especially when all the pieces are exactly the same. So this becomes a grid just because all the pieces are on the exact same type of cardboard. I included this piece. Once again, Yoshitomo Nara is not necessarily known for grids, but he did make a number of these pieces where he used these flip clocks as a type of canvas, and then started to display them in sets in these kind of grid installations, which kind of reminds me of some works from the 60s where people made grids of TV sets. I can't remember whose work that was that I remember seeing back in the day. Speaking about New York trips, the last time I was in New York, the previous time we were in New York, we saw a Raymond Pettibon retrospective. And the thing I wanted to emphasize about Pettibon in terms of his installations and his relationship to grids is that they may not really appear to be grid-like because they're very loose and they kind of deviate from the grid, and they're kind of messy. But if you actually look at the arrangements, because they're dominated by rectilinear works of art and they're lined up in certain places, they are loose grids. So grids don't have to be super tight. They can be quite loose. It's up to you to decide. So we're running out of time. So in the next section, I'm going to talk a little bit more about process boards and graphic design, and then we're going to start talking about student work. And then that should be pretty quick. And then that will be the end of part 2. All right, I will see you in part 2 of this lecture on grid display and process boards. Thank you very much.